They didn't give her a reason. No hearing, no explanation, no chance to defend herself. Just silence and the gate. Colonel Hayes had pointed toward the exit with the same finger that had signed her discharge papers 30 minutes earlier. No words, no ceremony. Just the cold efficiency of a military machine disposing of what it no longer needed. Maya Thompson had served her country for 15 years, 3 combat deployments, 2 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star that few people knew about because the mission had been classified so deep that even her own mother didn't know where she'd gotten the scar that ran from her left ear to her collarbone. But today, none of that mattered. Today, she was just another problem being quietly eliminated. What you're about to witness will leave you speechless. Before we reveal what happened next, and tell us in the comments, have you ever been dismissed by someone who had no idea who you really were? This story will remind you that heroes are often hiding in plain sight. The morning had started like any other at Fort Campbell. Maya had arrived at 5:30 a.m. for her shift as the base's lead intelligence analyst, carrying the same worn leather briefcase that had accompanied her through 3 war zones and countless classified briefings. She'd grabbed coffee from the same machine she'd used for the past 2 years, nodded to the same security guards who checked her credentials every morning, and settled into the same desk where she'd spent countless hours analyzing threats that could endanger American lives. The Intelligence Analysis Center at Fort Campbell operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Maya's shift began before most of the base had awakened, when the overnight analysts would brief her on any significant developments that had occurred during the dark hours. These briefings were critical, as terrorist organizations often operated under cover of darkness, moving money, people, and weapons, while much of the world slept. Maya had developed a reputation for being able to see patterns that others missed. Her colleagues often joked that she had an almost supernatural ability to connect seemingly unrelated pieces of intelligence into coherent threat assessments. What they didn't know was that Maya's skill came from years of studying not just the technical aspects of intelligence analysis, but the human psychology behind terrorist operations. She understood that terrorists were human beings with fears, motivations, and personal relationships that influenced their operational decisions. While other analysts focused on communications intercepts and financial transactions, Maya studied family structures, tribal loyalties, and personal vendettas that often determined when and where attacks would occur. On this particular morning, Maya had been working on what she considered one of the most important intelligence assessments of her career. For 3 weeks, she'd been tracking a terrorist network operating in the Horn of Africa that had been exhibiting unusual behavior patterns. The group's communications had increased significantly, their financial transactions had become more complex, and their recruitment efforts had intensified. But at 8:47 that morning, everything changed. "Thompson," Colonel Hayes had called from his office doorway. "My office. Now." Maya had looked up from the intelligence brief she'd been preparing, a comprehensive analysis of terrorist cell movements in the Horn of Africa that had taken her 3 weeks to compile. The report contained information that could save dozens of American soldiers' lives, intelligence gathered through sources she'd cultivated over years of patient work. The analysis had been painstaking work. Maya had correlated financial transactions from 6 different countries, communications intercepts from multiple intelligence agencies, and human intelligence reports from sources who risked their lives to provide information. The picture that had emerged was of a sophisticated terrorist organization planning something significant, but Maya hadn't yet been able to determine exactly what that something might be. "Sir, I'm just finishing the—" "Now, Thompson." The tone left no room for discussion. Maya had saved her work, locked her computer according to strict security protocols, and walked into the office that would become the scene of her professional execution. She had no idea that this moment would later be remembered as the beginning of the most important chapter of her career, not the end. Colonel Hayes hadn't looked up from the papers on his desk when she'd entered. The office was typical of a mid-level military commander: functional furniture, motivational posters about leadership and sacrifice, a wall covered with certificates and photographs from various deployments and training exercises. Behind Hayes's desk hung a large American flag and a smaller flag bearing the insignia of the 5th Special Forces Group. Hayes had simply slid a manila folder across the surface of his desk, its contents visible through the gap where the flap didn't quite meet the edge. Maya could see the distinctive letterhead of Army Human Resources Command, the organization responsible for personnel actions that could make or break military careers. "Your discharge papers," he'd said, still not meeting her eyes. "Effective immediately." Maya had stared at the folder for a full 10 seconds before touching it. 15 years of service, and it had come down to a manila folder on a desk. Inside those papers was the official termination of everything she'd worked toward since she was 18 years old and had first raised her right hand to take the oath of enlistment. The discharge paperwork was thorough and devastating. Maya's security clearance was being revoked immediately. Her access to all classified systems was terminated. Her military identification card was to be surrendered before she left the base. Most crushing of all, the reason for her discharge was listed as questions regarding loyalty and allegiance to the United States of America. "Sir, I don't understand," Maya had managed to say, her voice barely steady. "My performance evaluations have been consistently excellent. My security clearance has never been questioned. I've served 3 combat tours, earned commendations for my analysis work, and never had so much as a minor security violation." "That's not relevant to this decision," Hayes had replied, his voice as cold as winter wind. "This comes from higher up. Way higher up. Questions have been raised about your loyalties, about contacts you may have made during your overseas assignments, about information you may have passed to unauthorized individuals." The accusations hit Maya like physical blows. After 3 combat deployments where she'd risked her life daily to gather intelligence that protected American soldiers, after the scars she carried from roadside bombs and sniper fire, after the nightmares that still woke her up at 3 in the morning, her loyalty was being questioned. "What contacts? What unauthorized individuals? Sir, I need to know what I'm being accused of so I can defend myself." "That's classified," Hayes had said, finally looking up at her. "Above your clearance level. Above mine, for that matter. The decision has been made at levels where explanations aren't required and appeals aren't entertained." Hayes had stood up, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow across the desk. "Your clearance was revoked this morning at 6 a.m. Your access to all classified systems has been terminated. Your ID badge has been deactivated. Your computer accounts have been suspended. Security will escort you to clean out your desk. You have 15 minutes to gather personal items only. Everything else stays here." Maya had felt her world collapsing in real time. Without her clearance, she wasn't just losing her job. She was losing her identity. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd sacrificed for, everything she'd bled for was tied to that security clearance. It was her professional life, her career, her future, her sense of purpose. "Sir, this has to be a mistake. Let me speak to the security officer. Let me review the allegations. I have a right to know what evidence is being used against me." "There's no one to speak to, Thompson. The decision has been made at levels where your rights are less important than national security concerns." Hayes had walked to his office door and opened it. "Military police are waiting outside. They'll escort you to your desk and then to the gate. You have 15 minutes. The next 15 minutes had been the longest of Maya's life. 2 military police officers, both young enough to be her children, had flanked her as she'd gathered her personal belongings from the desk she'd occupied for 2 years. Every movement was watched. Every item was inspected before being placed in the cardboard box that would contain the remnants of her military career. Maya had packed a photo of her parents, taken the day she'd graduated from basic training. Her father had been so proud, wearing his own military dress uniform from his service in Vietnam. Her mother had cried tears of joy, knowing that her daughter was following in a family tradition of military service that stretched back 4 generations. She'd packed a small American flag that her grandmother had given her when she'd enlisted, explaining that it had been folded at her grandfather's funeral after he'd returned from World War II. The flag had been carried through 3 combat deployments, a talisman that reminded Maya why she served and what she was protecting. A coffee mug from her first deployment to Afghanistan went into the box, stained with the residue of 1,000 cups of terrible field coffee, but irreplaceable because it had been a gift from her team leader, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who'd been killed by an IED 2 weeks before their deployment ended. Everything else had to stay. Her files, carefully organized and meticulously maintained over 2 years of painstaking intelligence work. Her research notes containing insights that had taken years to develop and connections that existed nowhere else. Her reference books, marked with sticky notes and margin comments that represented thousands of hours of study and analysis. All of it belonged to the military, and according to the military, Maya Thompson no longer belonged to them. The other analysts in the office had watched in silence as she'd packed her things. Some had looked confused, trying to reconcile the woman they'd worked beside for 2 years with whatever crime she was supposed to have committed. Others had appeared sympathetic, but none had been brave enough to speak up or ask questions. Military culture didn't encourage challenging authority, especially when national security was involved. A few had seemed relieved that whatever had gotten Maya in trouble wasn't spreading to them, as if her alleged disloyalty might be contagious. They'd avoided eye contact and busied themselves with their own work, pretending not to notice the personal tragedy unfolding just a few feet away. Captain Sarah Mitchell, who'd been Maya's closest colleague and had learned everything she knew about Middle Eastern terrorist networks from Maya's patient mentoring, had turned away completely. She'd pretended to be absorbed in her computer screen, but Maya had seen her reflection in the monitor. Sarah had been crying, but she hadn't said a word. But none of them had spoken. None of them had asked questions. None of them had offered support or expressed doubt about the charges. They'd all just watched as 15 years of dedicated service was reduced to a small cardboard box of personal items, as if Maya had never been more than a temporary employee who'd finally reached the end of her contract. The walk to the main gate had felt like a death march. Maya had kept her head high and her back straight, maintaining military bearing even as her career crumbled around her. She'd learned in her first week of basic training that how you carried yourself mattered, that dignity was something that could only be taken from you if you gave it away. She'd served with honor for 15 years, earning the respect of colleagues and superiors through dedication, skill, and an unwavering commitment to the mission. She'd leave with honor, regardless of whatever lies or misunderstandings had led to this moment. Other soldiers and civilian employees had stared as the small procession passed through the base. Word traveled fast in a military community, and by now everyone knew that the lead intelligence analyst was being escorted off the base under suspicion of disloyalty. Some watched with curiosity, others with sympathy, a few with the kind of satisfaction that comes from seeing someone else's downfall. The security checkpoint that had been her daily routine for 2 years had become the scene of her final humiliation. The guards, both of whom had greeted her by name every morning for months, had been forced to take her ID badge, the same badge that had gotten her through the checkpoint thousands of times. Staff Sergeant Johnson, who'd always asked about her work and shared stories about his own family, couldn't meet her eyes as he confiscated her identification. Sergeant Martinez, who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan and understood the bond between soldiers, had looked uncomfortable, but had followed his orders without question. "Ma'am," Martinez had said quietly, avoiding eye contact, "I just want you to know, we appreciate your service." It was the only acknowledgement she'd received that her 15 years of dedication had meant something, that the woman being escorted off the base wasn't just a security risk, but a human being who'd sacrificed for her country. Maya had nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Any words she might have said would have either been a lie about understanding what was happening, or a truth about her anger and confusion that would have made things worse for everyone involved. She'd turned and walked through the gate that she'd entered thousands of times before, knowing she'd never enter it again. The finality of that moment had been overwhelming. Not just the end of a job, but the end of an identity that had defined her adult life. The street outside Fort Campbell was busy with morning traffic, soldiers heading to work in personal vehicles, civilian contractors making deliveries to the various support functions that kept a major military installation running, family members taking children to the base school or running errands at the commissary. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that Maya's world had just ended. She'd stood on the sidewalk for a moment, holding her cardboard box and trying to figure out what came next. The practical realities of her situation were overwhelming. Her car was still in the parking lot on base, but she couldn't go back for it. The gate guards had her badge, and without it, she was just another civilian who had no business on a military installation. Her apartment was off base, but it was paid for with her military salary, which had just stopped. Her health insurance was military. Her retirement plan was military. Her entire social circle consisted of people she'd worked with, people who would now view her with suspicion or pity. Everything that had defined her adult life was tied to the institution that had just expelled her, and Maya felt truly alone for the first time since she'd enlisted at 18. Maya had started walking, not because she had anywhere to go, but because standing still felt like giving up. She'd walked for 3 blocks, her military-issued boots clicking against the sidewalk in the same rhythm that had carried her through countless miles of marches, patrols, and missions in 3 different war zones. The familiar cadence of her steps provided a small comfort, a reminder that she was still the same person who'd served with distinction in Iraq, Afghanistan, and dozens of classified locations around the world. The uniform was gone, the badge was gone, the clearance was gone, but the woman who'd earned them remained. Then she'd heard it. The distinctive whop, whop, whop of helicopter rotors cutting through air. Maya had looked up automatically, her combat-trained instincts still sharp after all these years. She'd expected to see one of the base's training helicopters, or maybe a medical evacuation bird heading to the nearby Blanchfield Army Community Hospital. Instead, she'd seen something that made her stop walking and stare. A UH-60 Blackhawk helicopter, painted in the flat black of Special Operations Forces, was descending toward the street. Not toward Fort Campbell, not toward the nearby airfield, but toward the exact spot where Maya stood on the sidewalk. The aircraft was descending rapidly, but with the kind of precision that spoke to exceptional pilot skill and urgent purpose. Maya had seen enough military aircraft in her career to recognize that this wasn't a routine flight. The Blackhawk was flying a profile that suggested an emergency landing, but everything about its approach was too controlled, too deliberate. This was a planned operation, not an emergency. The helicopter's downwash had sent debris flying as it settled onto the asphalt 50 meters away. Cars had pulled over, drivers and passengers staring in amazement at the military aircraft that had just landed on a public street. People had started taking pictures with their phones, recording what they probably thought was some kind of emergency or elaborate training exercise. But Maya had known better. The Blackhawk wasn't making an emergency landing or conducting training. The aircraft was far too specialized, far too expensive, and far too important for routine operations. This was a bird used for missions that officially didn't exist, flown by pilots whose names appeared in no public records, carrying passengers whose very presence suggested operations at the highest levels of military command. The helicopter's engines had continued running, but at reduced power, what pilots called hot idle. The aircraft was ready to take off again at a moment's notice. This wasn't a landing, it was a pickup. The side door had slid open, and 3 figures in military flight suits had emerged. But they'd moved with the kind of precision and confidence that marked them as something more than regular aircrew. These were operators, Special Forces soldiers whose very presence suggested that whatever was happening was operating at levels of classification that Maya had only heard rumors about. The lead figure had removed his flight helmet as he'd approached Maya, revealing a face she'd recognized immediately. Colonel Marcus Webb, one of the most decorated special operations officers in the United States military. She'd never met him personally, but his reputation was legendary throughout the intelligence community. Webb didn't make social calls or handle routine business. When Webb showed up, it meant something significant was happening at the strategic level, something that required the attention of the military's most elite operators. "Maya Thompson," he'd called out over the noise of the helicopter. Maya had set down her cardboard box and come to attention, 15 years of military conditioning overriding the confusion and hurt of the morning's events. "Yes, sir." Webb had approached with the purposeful stride of an officer who was used to being obeyed without question, and who had never been disappointed in that expectation. When he'd reached Maya, he'd stopped precisely 3 feet away and rendered a salute that was sharp enough to cut glass. The salute was perfect, crisp, precise, held for exactly the right amount of time. It was the kind of salute that spoke to decades of military training and a deep respect for the traditions of service. Coming from an officer of Webb's stature, it was also a clear statement that he considered Maya worthy of military courtesy and respect. "Ma'am," he'd said, his voice carrying clearly despite the helicopter noise, "I'm Colonel Webb, Joint Special Operations Command. I'm here to personally apologize for what happened this morning and to ask you to come with me." Maya had returned the salute, her mind racing to process what was happening. JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, was the military's most elite unit, responsible for counterterrorism operations that existed in the shadows of official policy. They handled missions that were so classified that most members of Congress didn't know they existed. For a JSOC colonel to personally apologize to her meant that whatever had happened at Fort Campbell had been corrected at the highest possible levels of government. Sir, I'm not sure I understand. Ma'am, there was a massive security breach in the intelligence community 3 days ago. A foreign intelligence service managed to penetrate our systems and steal classified information. Several analysts across multiple bases had their loyalties questioned while we tracked down the source of the leak. Webb had paused, his expression growing more serious. Your discharge this morning was part of that investigation, but we now know with absolute certainty that you had nothing to do with the breach. In fact, ma'am, your work was instrumental in helping us identify the real perpetrator. Maya had felt the world spinning around her. 3 hours ago, she'd been discharged in disgrace, her loyalty questioned, and her career destroyed. Now, a colonel from the military's most elite unit was telling her that her own work had helped catch the real traitor. The patterns you identified in your analysis of terrorist financial networks led us to discover that someone had been selling information to hostile foreign governments, that someone has been arrested and will spend the rest of his life in federal prison. The revelation was staggering. Maya's analysis work, the same work that had been dismissed as potentially treasonous, had actually uncovered evidence of real treason committed by someone else. The intelligence brief you were working on this morning, Webb had continued, the one about terrorist movements in the Horn of Africa, contains information that's going to save a lot of American lives. We need you to finish that work, and we need you to do it with the kind of clearance that goes beyond top secret. Maya had felt dizzy. Sir, my clearance was revoked. My access was terminated. Colonel Hayes said, Your old clearance was revoked, Webb had confirmed. Your new clearance was approved by the Secretary of Defense this morning at 10 a.m., along with a promotion to Major and assignment to a joint task force that I can't discuss in public. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger as more people had stopped to watch the extraordinary scene unfolding on the street. Several people had continued recording with their phones, capturing the moment when Maya's career had been resurrected by forces she couldn't fully understand. Ma'am, Webb had continued, what happened to you this morning was wrong. It was based on incomplete information and poor communication between agencies. But it also revealed something important about your character. When you walked out of that gate, you maintained your dignity and your bearing. You didn't complain to the media, didn't demand explanations, didn't try to cause problems for the people who had wronged you. You acted like the professional soldier you are. Webb had gestured toward the Blackhawk, its rotors still turning. The mission I'm offering you is dangerous. It's classified at levels that most people don't even know exist, and it's absolutely critical to the security of our country. But I can't order you to take it. After what happened this morning, you'd be completely justified in walking away from all of this and never looking back. Maya had looked at the helicopter, then at the crowd of people watching her, then at the cardboard box containing the remnants of her old career. Everything she'd worked for had been taken away from her 3 hours ago. Now it was being offered back, along with opportunities she'd never dreamed possible. But more than that, she was being offered something that meant more than rank or clearance or career advancement. She was being offered the chance to serve her country at the highest possible level, to use her skills and experience to protect American lives in ways that most soldiers never could. Sir, Maya had said, when do we start? Webb had smiled, the first genuine emotion he'd shown since arriving. We start now. The brief you were working on this morning needs to be finished in 6 hours. There's a special operations team in Somalia that's depending on your intelligence to complete their mission safely. 14 American soldiers are counting on you to give them the information they need to come home alive. Maya had bent down and picked up her cardboard box. then had walked toward the helicopter without looking back. The crowd had parted as she'd approached the aircraft, many of them still recording what they probably thought was some kind of movie scene or elaborate publicity stunt. As Maya had climbed into the Blackhawk, she'd caught sight of Fort Campbell in the distance. Somewhere in that base, Colonel Hayes was probably dealing with phone calls from superiors who wanted to know why he'd discharged an analyst without proper authorization. Somewhere in that base, her former colleagues were probably wondering what had happened to the quiet woman who'd worked beside them for 2 years. But Maya wasn't thinking about Fort Campbell anymore. She was thinking about the mission ahead, about the soldiers whose lives might depend on the intelligence she could provide, about the opportunity to serve her country in ways she'd never imagined possible. The helicopter had lifted off as smoothly as it had landed, rising above the street and banking toward an airfield that didn't appear on any public maps. Through the window, Maya had watched the crowd below growing smaller, the people still pointing and taking pictures of the aircraft that had appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as mysteriously. 3 hours earlier, Maya Thompson had been discharged in disgrace from the United States Army. Now she was flying toward a classified mission that would define the rest of her career. As the Blackhawk had gained altitude, Colonel Webb had handed her a tablet containing intelligence briefings that made her previous work look like high school homework. The information on the screen was stamped with classification levels she'd only heard rumors about, gathered by sources whose very existence was known to fewer than 50 people in the entire government. The briefing materials revealed the scope of what she'd be working on. The terrorist network she'd been analyzing wasn't just operating in the Horn of Africa. It was part of a global organization with cells in 14 countries. The financial patterns she'd identified had led to the discovery of a funding network that stretched from Dubai to Detroit, involving shell companies, cryptocurrency exchanges, and legitimate businesses that had been infiltrated by hostile intelligence services. "Ma'am," Webb had said over the noise of the helicopter, "welcome to the war that officially doesn't exist." Maya had smiled as she'd begun reading the briefing. For the first time in months, she'd felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The aircraft had flown for 90 minutes before landing at a facility that Maya recognized from briefings, but had never seen in person. The installation was so classified that it didn't have an official name. Intelligence personnel simply called it the campus. From the air, it looked like a corporate office complex, complete with parking lots and landscaping that suggested nothing more threatening than an insurance company or consulting firm. But Maya knew that beneath the ordinary exterior lay some of the most sophisticated intelligence analysis capabilities in the world. This was where the intelligence community's most sensitive work was conducted, where threats to national security were identified and neutralized before they could develop into operational realities. The moment Maya had stepped off the helicopter, she'd been met by a team of analysts who'd been waiting for her arrival. They'd briefed her on the situation in Somalia, while walking through corridors that hummed with the kind of intense activity that marked a major operation in progress. The Special Operations Team in Somalia had been tracking a high-value target for 3 weeks. Their mission was to capture a terrorist leader who was planning a series of coordinated attacks against American interests in East Africa. But the target had gone to ground, and the team needed Maya's expertise to predict where he might surface next. Maya had been escorted to a secure conference room where her analysis would be conducted. The room contained computer systems that were more powerful than anything she'd ever worked with, connected to databases that contained intelligence from sources around the globe. For the first time in her career, she would have access to the complete picture. not just the fragments that were typically shared with base-level analysts. She'd spent the next 6 hours deep in analysis, connecting patterns that had been invisible when she'd only had access to limited information. The terrorist leader's movements weren't random. They followed a pattern based on family connections and tribal loyalties that would have been impossible to detect without access to human intelligence sources that operated at the highest levels of classification. The terrorist leader, known only by the code name Scorpion, had been moving through a network of safe houses that were connected by relationships spanning 3 generations. Maya had been able to trace these connections through financial records, communications intercepts, and travel patterns that painted a picture of a man who trusted only family and childhood friends who'd proven their loyalty over decades. But more importantly, Maya had identified a pattern in Scorpion's behavior that suggested he was planning to meet with a major financial backer within the next 48 hours. The meeting would have to take place at a location that was secure, significant to both parties, and accessible despite the increased security presence in the region. Maya had cross-referenced historical intelligence with current surveillance data and identified 3 possible locations where such a meeting could take place. Each location had been used for similar meetings in the past, but only one offered the combination of security and significance that would appeal to someone of Scorpion's operational sophistication. By early evening, Maya had produced an intelligence brief that pinpointed the terrorist leader's most likely location within a radius of 2 kilometers. The information was immediately transmitted to the Special Operations Team in Somalia, who launched their mission 12 hours later. The operation had been a complete success. The terrorist leader was captured alive, along with 4 of his key lieutenants, and a cache of documents that revealed plans for attacks that would have killed hundreds of civilians. 14 American soldiers had completed their mission and returned home safely, their success built on the foundation of Maya's analysis. But the documents captured during the operation revealed something even more significant. Scorpion hadn't been planning attacks just in East Africa. He'd been coordinating with terrorist cells across multiple continents as part of a sophisticated plan to conduct simultaneous attacks during the upcoming holiday season. The intelligence Maya had helped develop would lead to operations across 12 countries over the following 6 months. Terror cells were disrupted in France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and the United States itself. Financial networks that had taken years to establish were dismantled overnight. Communication systems that terrorist organizations had considered secure were compromised and monitored. 6 months later, the intelligence brief that Maya had completed would lead to the disruption of terrorist networks in 12 countries and the prevention of 17 planned attacks. The operation would never be publicly acknowledged, but it would be studied in military schools for decades as an example of how accurate intelligence could turn an impossible mission into a complete success. But that evening, as Maya had finally allowed herself to rest in a secure facility that she couldn't identify or describe, she had simply been grateful for the chance to serve again. The morning's humiliation had been transformed into an opportunity that would define her career and save countless lives. Major Maya Thompson would go on to serve with the Joint Task Force for 3 years, during which time her analysis would contribute to operations that prevented dozens of terrorist attacks and saved thousands of American lives. She would receive commendations that couldn't be publicly acknowledged and participate in missions that would never appear in any official record. Sometimes, Maya would later reflect, the worst moments of your life are just the setup for the best moments that follow. Sometimes, getting kicked out is the first step toward getting called up. And sometimes, when the system fails you, a Blackhawk lands to remind you that your real value was never in question, it was just being tested. Maya Thompson's story reminds us that sometimes our darkest moments are just the beginning of our greatest opportunities. When the system failed her, something bigger stepped in to recognize her true worth.